Tonight we're going to be looking at Native Americans in the United States, which will be in comparison to what we're looking at tomorrow night, which is Native Americans in North Carolina. So don't get those mixed up. Since you're going to be working on your Native American activity tomorrow, it's important that you watch this video first and then watch your North Carolina video second. So the guiding question that I want you to keep in mind is, how did pre-colonial Native Americans influence American culture as a whole? You're going to see as we go through this presentation that a lot of the influences that you see today come from Native Americans. One of the big things that does not mention in this presentation is, of course, lacrosse, which I know a lot of people play today. That came from the Native American culture. So the first thing is important to understand is how the first Americans got here. So we're looking at almost 20,000 years ago that all of this was going on. Siberian hunters, and keep in mind that Siberia is that northern part of Asia and Russia that connects together. They became the first American inhabitants. And they're going to do this through the Bering Strait. And the Bering Strait connected the northeastern part of Russia with Alaska, and it was just this really essentially sheet of ice that the Native Americans crossed. Of course, that's not there anymore, but so you can see how this looks, this arrow where the Native Americans came down and then came through the United States. So 14,000 years ago, they're going to reach the tip of South America, so which leads them all the way through North and South America by that point. So as far as the food, climate, and culture, at first Native Americans throughout the United States enjoyed a really good supply of meat. That is not going to last very long. Some of those animals that were used became extinct from overhunting, and a lot of scientists kind of debate whether it was actually the Native Americans that did that or whether it was that whole phenomena of global warming. Then about 5,000 years ago, we're going to have our first agricultural revolution. Agriculture, of course, is farming. So crops are going to start to be grown by these tribes, including maize, squash, and beans. Maize is kind of like corn. So we're going to start to see that agriculture, which is going to allow the Native Americans to settle into one general area. Which, like I just said, it shifted from that nomadic hunting and gathering to permanent villages and larger cities. So the next few slides are going to look at the different groups within the United States and the characteristics of those groups. If you're planning to use the chart that I showed you in class today, then go ahead and get that out, because that's where you're going to get the information for this. And if you're choosing to just take notes in your notebook, you can do it that way as well. So the first group we're going to look at is the North and the Northwest coast. So that's all the way up in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, those areas. And the tribes that were there were the Aleut and the Inuit. They lived, like I said, in the islands off of Alaska. Their climate was really, really cold, obviously. It was too cold for farming, so they really had to depend on hunting. Their major source of hunting was whales, seals, and walruses. And they actually used kayaks to reach those areas where those animals were living. They made arrowheads and spears from the bones and antlers of the animals that they hunted. Caribou was a big part of the tundra up there. And if they lived by forests, they used wood for houses, boats, and other objects that they might have carved. Then we're going to move down to the people of the West. So that's California and the Great Basin. A lot of those cultures lived off of hunting and gathering. Deer, antelope, rabbits, birds, things along those lines were the major source of their diet. While the women hunted and gathered, they also made baskets. And those baskets were really considered these very unique pieces of art. They had really strong spiritual beliefs, as we're going to talk about throughout this, that really connected them to nature, as most Native American groups did. So next up is the people of Mexico. That was the Aztecs, and the Aztecs had one of the most powerful civilizations during the time. They had a huge capital city, and they had some very, very advanced ways of going about doing things. They drained the swamps that were nearest to their settlements in order to provide irrigation or to get water to their agriculture. That allowed them to grow plenty of food. It actually allowed them to grow excess food, which was nice for the colder months or the months that might have been more dry. They were very, very warlike people. They conquered most of their neighbors and turned their neighbors into slaves or used them as their wives typically. And they had a very complex society, kind of similar to a society that you might talk about today, where the rulers were considered to be the highest class. Priests and government workers were kind of the middle class, and then those slaves that I was just talking about and other servants were at the bottom class. So it's going to be one of the few Native American societies that we actually see that class system going on. Then we're going to move to people of the Southwest, and that is going to be north of Mexico, north of the Aztec locations. It's considered the Southwest today, so Arizona, Texas, primarily, or the Southwest regions, Nevada. They're the Pueblo people. So they also used irrigation to help for their farming because you know that it's really, really dry and hot down there. They lived in homes of dried brick and mud, and they also were able to raise corn, beans, and squash as a result of that irrigation system. They also actually kept turkeys in captivity and used those turkeys to eat off of and hunted some smaller game as well. The people of the Great Plains. So that's the grassland region that went from the Mississippi River west to the Rocky Mountains. A lot of those people were nomads. Some of them lived in villages along the river because it allowed for easy farming, but the majority of them followed their game or followed the hunting. They used bison, and if you've ever been to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., you've seen that display of the Native Americans chasing these big bison over the edge of a cliff. That's how they were able to kill and to get the food and the houses that they need through those bison. They lived in large earthen lodges. A lot of those times the lodges was built underground, so it gave them some extra protection. And then there's people of the Southeast, and that's east of Texas all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So that could be Alabama and Georgia, places along those lines. They had a really long growing season, which made them more dependent on farming. Women did a lot of the farming, and men actually did most of the hunting. And then it's a matrilineal society. And a matrilineal society means that your heritage is essentially based on the women in your family. So today, most of us live, it's a patrilineal society. Your last name is more likely to be the last name of your father. Okay, that means it's a patrilineal society. If it was a matrilineal society, we would all be named after our mothers. And then the eastern woodlands, which is the areas that are going to be closest to North Carolina, and we're going to talk about those North Carolina tribes tomorrow. Lots of fish and game, but overall it was a colder climate. You're going to have more snow, and especially northeast of North Carolina. Forests really covered the area, so they were dependent on those forests. They were typically spoke Iroquoian or Algonquin. They were very dependent on the hunting of game, especially deer. They used a technique called slash and burn agriculture, which essentially they would burn their fields, and then after those fields were burnt, they would leave the ashes there, and those ashes would help to make the soil richer for crops in the future. So they rotated their crops every year based on that slash and burn agriculture. They lived in longhouses or wigwams, and they surrounded their villages with high fences made of poles. For the most part, the Iroquois didn't really trust each other very much. There was a lot of arguments and fights between the various tribes in the Iroquois, so they felt the need to protect themselves. Later on, right before the Europeans came into the United States, they formed a league. It was called the Iroquois League, and those tribes were able to unite together and solve some of their problems. So it was kind of a neat way for them to watch that government form. So keep all of this in mind for your activity tomorrow in class, and don't forget to watch about the North Carolina tribes tomorrow. And I will look forward to seeing y'all then.